And an unarmed, mentally ill man has just been charged with assault in an incident where police officers shot two innocent bystanders near Times Square. The man being charged is Glenn Broadnax, and police are holding him at fault for the injuries because they say he instigated the incident. The altercation started when Broadnax walked into traffic at a Manhattan intersection and jumped into the path of oncoming cars. At that point, police officers tried to detain him. Soon after, Broadnax reached into his pocket, and officers assumed he was reaching for a gun, so they fired and mistakenly shot two women nearby. Broadnax's lawyer is claiming that his client was emotionally disturbed, saying he suffers from anxiety, depression, and possible delusions. The attorney for one of the wounded bystanders had this to say about the charges. It's an incredibly unfortunate use of prosecutorial discretion to be prosecuting a man who didn't even injure my client. It's the police who injured my client. Regardless, the bail for Broadnax has been set at $100,000, and the two officers have been placed on administrative leave. But it's not just Glenn Broadnax who's suffering as a result of a mental illness. It's also people like Bobby Bennett, a mentally ill man who was shot 4 times by a police officer, despite the fact that he showed no threat of force. Or how about Kelly Thomas, a homeless man who was beat to death by 6 officers who responded to a call about a man jiggling car door handles in a transit center parking lot. Turns out Thomas was suffering from severe schizophrenia. And of course, there was the case of Miriam Carey, a Connecticut mother who was shot to death after trying to ram her car through a White House barricade. Later, it was discovered that Carey was suffering from postpartum psychosis. It's altercations like these that are beginning to call into question just how police are trained to deal with the mentally ill. To discuss this a little bit more, I was joined earlier by Mayo Bartlett, a civil rights attorney. I first asked him whether it's mandatory for all police departments across the country to train their police force on how to respond to the mentally ill.
Well, across the country, each department can promulgate its own rules and regulations, so it's impossible for me to really know at this point whether they all have such regulations, but it's clear that each and every department should. And simply for the standpoint that it's essential that people who may have mental illness, whether they suffer from mental illness or they're temporarily agitated, should rest assured that they have the best opportunity to come away from an encounter with police in a safe way. And it's equally important for the officers themselves, because if they're improperly trained, they run the risk of escalating a situation and also putting themselves and their fellow officers in harm's way.
Sure. Well, for the police officers who are exposed to that knowledge, what does that training look like, or what might you think it would look like? And would you say it's adequate?
I think that training should deal, first of all, with the understanding that generally time is on your side, and also the fact that the goal should be to de-escalate situations and to keep them as calm as possible. Now, the vast majority of police departments, if not all, train their officers in how to de-escalate. And that's usually embodied in their use of force protocol, which starts out with the officer's mere presence alone. And if you simply think about someone driving on a highway, when you see a police vehicle on the side of that highway, everyone driving tends to slow down and tends to drive more rationally than they would if that vehicle wasn't there. It's the same concept with the presence of police who are on foot.
Right. Well, some would argue that police officers don't always know the suspect has a mental illness and that it's hard for them to distinguish between someone who is ill and perhaps someone who is under the influence of drugs, for example. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I think that's why training is so essential for police officers. If you look at people who are in other professions, it's less essential because you're not dealing with them in the manner in which police generally encounter people. But quite often, police encounter people with emotional disturbance when they're going to render medical assistance to those people. They're not a suspect of a crime. And so, for instance, we have 3 cases right now where the police have shot and killed each of the individuals, and they were not responding to a crime in either one. One is Kenneth Chamberlain Sr. in White Plains. The other one is Samuel Cruz in New Rochelle, and Mohammed Ba in Manhattan. And in each of those circumstances, the police were called there. Well, in 2 of the circumstances, in Mr. Cruz and Mr. Ba's matters, the police were called there by loved ones who were concerned about their family members, but not because a crime had been committed. And with respect to Mr. Chamberlain, who was a 68-year-old retired Marine, Mr. Chamberlain happened to roll over and trigger his life aid pendant by mistake. And that's a pendant that was designed to allow him to call for assistance if he had a medical emergency. So there, none of these individuals were aware that the police would be arriving.
Wow. Well, in the case of Bobby Bennett, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. His mother did call the police department to come help with her son. She couldn't handle it on her own, but she specifically warned them that he had a mental issue. Of course, we know that he was vigorously shot thereafter. Is there something more as a family member she was supposed to do to prevent that from happening, or did she do all she could?
Well, she probably did all she could because, unfortunately, we are not trained in how to deal with mental illness. The other issue is if the police department had available protocols and utilized those protocols, because it's two things. Sometimes there is a protocol in place and the department or the officers are not aware of it or choose not to employ it. But if they have a proper protocol in place, they would have brought a mental health professional along with them and someone who would have been able to assess the situation and determine exactly what was necessary so that everybody could leave that encounter safely.
Right. And
after all, they were there to give assistance. They weren't there because he was committing a crime. Right,
exactly. What's your guess as to why the police officers in this incident didn't seem to act with any kind of sensitivity? I mean, do you think there's a breakdown in the way that that information is communicated to the police officers, or is it just like you said, you know, they're ignoring the fact that he has a mental illness?
Well, number one, that's an outstanding point because we don't know what transpires between that initial call for assistance and the message that the police themselves actually received. So you can call and say that you haven't heard from your loved one in a long time, you're concerned about their well-being. And we don't know what the police dispatcher is saying until you hear the radio run or the 911 tape. What will happen also is that the person who's in the home, and this may be one of the most critical points, is that the person in the home has not called the police.
That was Mayo Bartlett, a civil rights attorney.